All right. Chris Ransom here with William Yannish and Brandice Bell, and William Yannish the third, that is, the three on the screen. But you can see that. But here's what's going down tonight. We're going to talk about the first 12-team college football playoff that was released. I'll go through my rankings, and we'll compare them to the actual rankings, and we'll see what we agree and disagree with. Should we go in reverse order, or should we start at the top of the list?
Uh, let's start at the top of the list. Everyone knows the number ones, and
Yeah.
we'll just go down from there.
Number one in the rankings was Oregon. They're the number one team. They're number one seed. I have no issue with that. I had Oregon at number one as well in my rankings. At two, this is where things start to get interesting because Ohio State was two in the polls, but they get demoted down to five. My number two team is currently Miami, and that's currently because they're I think the undefeated team should be ranked higher at this point in the season, and they beat the Florida Gators by a bigger margin than the Georgia Bulldogs. So for me, Miami's number two. I know that's going to seem like an unconventional argument, and maybe Georgia beats Miami in a head-to-head game if their defense plays lights out and Carson Beck wins a turnover battle versus Cam Ward. But right now, looking at things as they are, the Hurricanes got through the bulk of their hard games, and, you know, I would say they're number two over Georgia. I have BYU at three. I don't think they'll remain at three, but I've got them there now, and I've got Georgia at four. But regardless, I think you can make an argument for Georgia over BYU, even though Georgia has one loss to a really good Alabama team. But regardless of how you feel about that top four, I think that's the top four, and I don't think anybody has any issues there. I think everyone agrees that should be the top four.
Definitely.
I ended up putting Indiana at 5 because they're 9-0, and I am open to moving them down if they lose to Ohio State in a few weeks. But looking at their schedule, they got Michigan at 3:30 this week on CBS. They get Ohio State next week, and then they which is essentially a semifinal game, and then they play Purdue to end the year. So Indiana, that game against Ohio State, that's essentially a Big Ten semifinal game. Whoever wins that's most likely playing Oregon, because Oregon, the hardest road opponent on their schedule was Michigan, and they beat Ohio State. And Oregon's remaining opponents are Maryland, Wisconsin on the road, and Washington at home. And while Wisconsin could be a trap game, they couldn't beat Penn State at home. They couldn't beat Alabama at home. I don't think they're going to beat Oregon at home. And that Indiana-Ohio State game is essentially a semifinal. I have Indiana at 5. 6, I have Army because they're the only undefeated group of 5 team left. Army was not included in the 12-team playoff. It's probably because their schedule. They play North Texas this week. They get a bye week and then play Notre Dame on the 23rd. Then they play UTSA, who actually looks like one of the better teams in their conference the following week on the road, which they could end up losing to both Notre Dame and UTSA. I could see why the selection committee left them out of the playoff and demoted them to 25. And if they lost to Notre Dame and UTSA, I'd agree. They'd be the 25th best team in the country. But right now, I think they've earned the benefit of the doubt over Boise, but I don't think they're going to get it because Boise's got an easier schedule. They're a more fun team to watch, and they've got a high-profile star running back in Genty, whereas Army, it's a good team. It's a great story, but at the end of the day, the media expects them to come back to reality. And then I ended up putting Ohio State at 7, Texas at 8, Penn State at 9, Tennessee at 10, Notre Dame at 11, and Boise at 12. And SMU just missed my rankings. My only issue with the rankings in general was Army not being in the top 12 and Alabama being at 11. I mean, Alabama lost to Vanderbilt. They lost to Tennessee. They barely beat Georgia after blowing a massive lead. They almost lost to South Carolina. Alabama should not be in the top 12 over Texas A&M. If you're going to put another SEC team in, I think Texas A&M should be in over Bama. And I also think SMU is more deserving over Bama because SMU's undefeated in the ACC. That should matter. That should count for something because What's going to end up happening is if SMU beats Miami in the ACC title, 2 ACC teams are going to get in. That's the only way the ACC can have 2 teams in the playoff, if you really think about it. Because if Miami goes undefeated, they're probably going to be the 2 or 3 seed, and they're going to be the only ACC team in the tournament.
Yeah, that's the problem with a lot of this. There's been a lot of parity, since this 12-team playoff began. And you're completely right about Army. That is one thing that being undefeated, they're the ones who make these schedules. And if the team's undefeated, I mean, they should definitely be considered for that. I understand the Boise State sentiment because of Ashton Jeanty and his Heisman hopeful. I mean, 1,525 yards, 20 touchdowns. I mean, averaging 8 yards a carry. I mean, dude is an absolute beast. But they're putting that in there because it fits them, it fits the hype, and everything else. But like I said, I feel that Army should definitely get some sentiment, and Alabama, that's a young program, and with a DeBar getting what was left after Saban left, but that's my sentiment.
I'm not saying Alabama doesn't deserve to be in there at all. They just don't deserve to be in there right now. With Army at undefeated, Boise State at 1 loss, both those teams are more deserving. And then I would say SMU's number 13. And then you can open it up to who's number 14. You can debate whether it's Alabama or Texas A&M or Ole Miss or LSU. The next team out of the SEC, besides the 1-loss teams, Georgia, Tennessee, and Texas, you can debate that 4th SEC team at 14.
Well, the one thing about the
now.
ACC is everyone was expecting, Cade Klubnik and Clemson to do something. And I never, ever thought that. I mean, he's a streaky quarterback. I mean, that program just hasn't been it since the days of Deshaun Watson. I mean, what do you think, Brandice?
Well, I think going back to what you guys were saying, I don't really think that Alabama needs to be in. Obviously, I'm a little biased, but honestly, there's a lot of teams that are not just undefeated, but undefeated in their conference, which is crazy. And unfortunately, none of those teams are SEC teams. So if any team deserves to make it, it's likely you got to pull from every conference but the SEC first. I think that obviously we know why Alabama is where they are. There's still going to be some, favoritism despite the system being a little bit fairer. And I think if they do make it, there's going to be a lot of people that are questioning how they got in.
I'm not saying Alabama doesn't deserve to be there at the end of the year. I'm saying they don't deserve to be there right now because you look at the undefeated teams, you look at the 1-loss teams that are the best in their conference, and you look at the 1-loss teams in the SEC and the other teams that are undefeated in conference play like SMU. The reality is we're probably going to get 3 or 4 SEC teams in whether we like it or not. Same with the Big Ten. We're probably only going to get 1 ACC team in, the Hurricanes, if they win out. Now, if SMU wins the ACC title over Miami, we'll get 2 ACC teams in. Let's say SMU loses in the next 3 weeks and Pittsburgh ends up beating. If SMU loses 2 of their final 3 games, that Pittsburgh Clemson game has a lot more on the line because essentially the winner of that would go to the ACC championship because Clemson did not play SMU this year, and they'd own the tiebreaker over SMU. So if SMU does slip up, they do play Boston College next. That's their next opponent. If SMU does slip up, that Pitt-Clemson game in a few weeks at Acrisure Stadium in Pittsburgh is going to have a lot more on the line in terms of implications. But the only way we're going to see 2 ACC teams in the playoffs is if one of the 3 teams, SMU, Clemson, or Pittsburgh, ends up beating the Hurricanes in the ACC title. Because I just think the other ACC teams are too far down in the totem pole.
Yep.
I don't know. I mean, if SMU wins out, which I think they can, and loses to Miami in the ACC championship, or who knows? Let's say Miami loses. If Miami loses in the ACC championship, they're still going to make it, and obviously
Yeah,
SMU will then make it.
that's
So there is
that's
a
the only
possibility.
scenario where SMU would make it. They'd be like a 4 seed, and Miami would be like a 7 or 8 seed. I think if Miami's undefeated and SMU's got 2 losses to Miami and BYU, is that enough to get them in the playoff? Maybe as an 11 or 12 seed, but I don't know. It's gonna be very close, Brandice. It's gonna be very close. But if SMU beats Miami, or if Clemson or Pittsburgh beats Miami, Miami's in as a 7 or 8 seed instead of a 2 seed, and the other ACC teams in. So the only scenario where I could see 2 ACC teams in the playoff is if somebody beats Miami in the ACC title. And we've seen some shady officiating in the ACC with the Hurricanes this year, William. So maybe that shady officiating will end up hurting the Hurricanes, because if you think about it, you're the ACC chairman and you got all these boosters and you want multiple teams in the playoff. What better way to...
the thing is a commissioner from the SEC came out last week, wrote a memo, saying that there'd be no, faked injuries for timeouts, that they need to clean up everything, and just, I mean, that's completely respectable, but it actually needs to happen, and I mean, it's the whole thing, and they should do that, throughout Division One, period. Not just the SEC. I mean, that should be written to everyone.
Yeah.
I want to take a second and just put in perspective what Army has done this year. They're running 37.88 points per game to 11.25 for their opponents. They've had 2,795 rushing yards versus 828. That's 3 times the amount. Average per attempt, 6.4 to 3.2. That's 2 times. Average per game, 340.1 to 88.3. That's a little over 4 times. 33 touchdowns to 3 touchdowns. And they're passing, obviously, running an option offense and everything else. It's still the point that they have absolutely dominated their opponents, and they haven't, trailed in a game this season. I mean, that needs to be put in perspective, and for Army, and just saying to Division One and everyone else, I will die on this hill that Army right now deserves to be in the playoffs. So.
They do. I'm with you, William. That's why I basically said that Army. That's why I've got Army at number 6 in my rankings. They deserve to be here until they lose a game. If they lose a game and it's like a 34-7 loss to Notre Dame, then we can filter them out at that point. But until that happens, they deserve to be here.
Very much, very much. But, I mean, it's one thing, like I said, the hype, they need to stop worrying about the hype, They're the ones that put together the schedules, and they need to put the most deserving teams in there, not the shiniest.
Yeah. And the Power 5 teams are going to be treated like a gold medal, silver medal, bronze medal, especially when it comes to the SEC, the ACC, and the Big Ten.
Exactly. I definitely understand the Ashton Jeanty sentiment, 1,500 yards, like I said, 20 touchdowns, versus Oregon and Dan Lanning defense, 192 for 3 touchdowns, still a 7.7, yards an average. His lowest output was against Portland State for 127 yards, but he still averaged 11.5 per, and I mean, like I said, I think maybe it's just because that's the shiniest team because of, his Heisman hopes. So.
And they only lost 1 game to Oregon. I'm not saying Boise State's isn't deserving at all. I'm saying Army's more deserving. I've got Army at 6 and Boise at 12. So Army's twice as deserving as Boise, in my opinion. So if they're at 25 in the polls, and Vanderbilt, you take Vanderbilt out of the top 25 entirely, that tells me that Alabama is not qualified to be in the 12-team playoff. Nothing against Alabama, but they're not good enough right now. And even if
they haven't done it.
even if you only put one group of 5 team, Army or Boise, you can make the argument SMU's resume is better overall than Alabama's right now because they're undefeated in conference play. That's the thing.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. But no, I mean, Oregon being number one, like I said, I love Dan Lanning. He is actually my top coach in college football right now, and that just goes back to the Colorado game last year and his speech at halftime. That
It
they're
was a
not doing this on
pregame
social
speech, I
media.
think. I think he made a pregame speech about how they're just all hype, all flash, and then the team came out fired up and just kicked butt.
Yeah, well, at halftime he came out and said, that they're not. This isn't on social media. This is out on the field, and they went and did it, and that, I mean that speech fired me up. So I mean, I understand how they're number one, and obviously, I mean they have torched everybody in their way. So
All right, so quickly here, we've got 11 minutes left. Who's the most undeserving team in the top 12? I mean, in your opinion, Brandice's opinion, I feel like nobody's awful, but I also feel like a lot of teams are overhyped. There's a few teams, Alabama in particular, that I feel like I would say Alabama's the most undeserving in the top 12 because of the 2 losses to Vanderbilt and Tennessee, but they only beat South Carolina by 6 points. They barely beat Georgia after dominating most of that game early. So I would say Alabama, as harsh as that sounds. I mean, so
I'll let you go
Doesn't
first,
sound harsh
Brandis.
to me at all.
okay,
A bit of
so they
bias.
put Ohio State versus Boise State in 5-12, Indiana versus Tennessee in 9-8, Alabama, Texas in 11 versus 6, and Penn State versus Notre Dame in 10 versus 7. And then they had the same top 4 as we did, just a different order.
I definitely have to do the Alabama thing. I mean, I picked him to win it all in my original bracket. And I have DeBar as one of my top 3 coaches in all of college football. You know, and they just haven't done it this year. They haven't figured it out. Milrow hasn't figured it out. I expected him just to blossom under the system, and he has shown absolute flashes of brilliance. But then, they bomb out, and
And this Alabama LSU game in Death Valley this week's essentially an elimination game because I think Alabama's like 11 in the polls, LSU's like 15. The committee would love
and
for
I love
both teams to
LSU.
be. The committee would probably love to have one of those teams get in at 9-3, but the reality is, I don't think either team's deserving enough right now as it is. So, and you've got Tennessee, you've got Texas, you've got Georgia all at 1 loss. A&M's the only team with 1 conference loss. So that's the top 4 right now as things stand. And that Alabama LSU game, it's an elimination game, but I think LSU's only conference loss is to Texas A&M, so they'd be 5th in the conference standings. As Alabama would be like 6th. So, but that's an elimination game for both LSU and Alabama. Whoever loses that is not making the 12-team playoff. They're probably going to be playing in another New Year's Bowl.
It's a possibility that even if LSU managed to beat them, that they get knocked out by Vanderbilt. So, neither could make it also.
Definitely neither.
Especially if Ole Miss beats Georgia. I don't think that'll happen, but if it did, that would cause even more drama and chaos in the system.
But also Texas A&M hasn't exactly lit it up this year, and they're not even quite. They've been having quarterback issues quite a bit, so I can make that argument that they wouldn't be deserving. I've seen flashes of brilliance in Connor Weigman, but he hasn't done it either. He's got a ton of stuff to clean up. Before he can ever try to call himself NFL ready. So like I said, I can make that argument as well.
Yeah, and Garrett Nussmeier lost head-to-head to Connor Weigman at Texas A&M a few weeks ago, and then Texas A&M got crushed by Lenore Sellers in South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
So
Definitely. And, Nussmeier he's a young quarterback. He didn't have anything before the season. I had to absolutely, scowl tape to put out an evaluation on him. It still ended up, being a first round quarterback, but, he still had so far to go. I saw him as uh, younger Quinn Ewers. I mean, they're the same type quarterback, do kind of the same thing, but Nussmeier is a coach's son. He's a little bit smarter. He has more improv than Ewers, and I think that they can really do some damage if they can get down to it. But that Texas A&M deal just isn't enough. But I don't know.
I'm struggling with Tennessee being ranked higher than Indiana, especially considering they lost to a team that wasn't even ranked.
they lost to Arkansas on the road, Brandice. That's right. They went on the road to Arkansas and they lost. And that, I think Arkansas only had one loss at the time, but then they've lost 2 or 3 games since then, and they've looked a lot worse since those losses. But yeah, and people were hyping that game up. It was the biggest Tennessee-Arkansas game since '98, and in '98, Arkansas did beat Tennessee beat Arkansas to have a perfect season. But this Tennessee team couldn't do what the '98 Tennessee team did in the very first year of the BCS. And I like Tennessee. I think I've got Tennessee at 9 in my rankings, behind 10. I have them at 10. I have Ohio State at 7, behind Army, Texas at 8, Penn State at 9, and Tennessee at 10. So I do have Tennessee at 10 ahead of Notre Dame, but I think 8 is a little too high for them when you take into account that Indiana hasn't lost yet. And Indiana strength of schedule isn't good. That's a big metric with this selection committee, is they value strength of schedule over everything else. Because Georgia has a tougher strength of schedule than Miami, but they're still ranked ahead of Miami in the committee's poll.
That's one thing too. Is I love Nico Imaliva, but he's another young quarterback that's far from polished, and he has great potential. To possibly come out next year and do something. I haven't done a full formal evaluation on
very
it.
First play Nico made this season, he went through all 6 progressions against Chattanooga, but we haven't seen him dominate like that on a consistent basis. Mm-hmm. In fact, if you look at just the Arkansas game and the Oklahoma game, you can make the argument he's only making 1 to 2 reads, and once those reads are there, he either takes off and runs or he makes a bad decision. And that's the problem with Nico. It's not a bad thing, but it's something he's got to get cleaned up before the 26th draft if he wants to be the first pick in that draft, because the potential to be the number 1 pick's there, but you just haven't seen it consistently in spades.
Very much. But that's one thing that these quarterbacks can do nowadays in the land of nil. They can pick and choose what year they come out, and that's one thing that they need to sit back. It's like Brady talks about, he got to sit back for 4 years, learn how to go through progressions, drop back, do everything, and I mean, look what happened to him.
Well, he's also a freshman.
Yeah, exactly.
So
he sat out
he could easily go the Bo Nix route and just stay in college till he's 30, and come out when there aren't any other quarterbacks in his class. And by then he'll have all the skills he needs.
Hey. Jaden Daniels, Spencer Rattler, I don't know how many others were also all born in 2002. I mean, everyone was picking on Bo Nix, calling him this old man, and I'm like, oh my God. And it's like, at least, he transferred from Auburn, where he looked like garbage, and came to Oregon and just, turned into what he is now. But
yeah,
so there's that.
I've got 3 games for this week. We'll pick 3 games for this week. We're not going to go through the entire top 25. I'm going to start with a Big 12 game between two-loss Big 12 teams, both 1 loss in the conference. Colorado, Texas Tech. I believe the winner of this game, this is an elimination game in the Big 12, with Iowa State at 1 loss, with Kansas State now at 2 losses in the conference, and Iowa State's going to Kansas. I think Kansas might upset Iowa State this week, but, this is an elimination game, because if Kansas State beats Iowa State, Colorado basically Colorado's only path to the Big 12 championship is Kansas beats Iowa State, and then Kansas State, then Iowa State beats Kansas State, because then Kansas State would have 2 conference losses and Colorado would only have 1, and they'd own the head-to-head tiebreaker for fewest conference losses among the teams outside of BYU. I think that's Colorado's only path in, but I'm going to take Colorado over Texas Tech. But if Taj Brooks goes off, Coach Prime could be in trouble, and this is in Lubbock. Texas Tech does host this game. So who do you like in this one? Then we'll go through the 2 SEC matchups, and then we'll call it a night.
Go ahead, Brandice.
It's kind of a toss-up. I think Kansas State could definitely pull out a W. I do think that is Colorado's best way to the championship, the Big 12 championship. So I'm rooting for them in that regard. But I'm not exactly sure if Iowa State is stout enough to be able to handle Kansas's run game. So we'll see.
All right.
Yeah. Texas Tech versus Colorado. I'm taking Baron Morton and Taj Brooks. Another young quarterback. He's fought through a ton of injuries, though, and I'll definitely take Texas Tech over Colorado just because I explained the other day how that they could actually get to the Big 12 championship, but they've lost since. Also, I'll die on this hill too. But as for Kansas State. Iowa State, I'll definitely take Iowa State. Rocco Beck is a great quarterback. He's another player's son that has been groomed for the position and everything else. And they're 1 loss behind Texas Tech. So I'll go with that.
Wait, it's actually not Kansas State. It's Kansas.
Yeah, Iowa State plays Kansas, but they play Kansas State in the final week of the season. Few weeks from now, not now, but that's a big game, Brandice. I think Colorado has to win out, and Kansas State has to beat Iowa State in that regular season finale. And I think Kansas has to beat Iowa State this week in order for Colorado to get in. It's a long shot, but the winner of the Colorado-Texas Tech game can still make the Big 12 championship if they win out.
Yeah, I've got Iowa State over Kansas this week. And when it comes to Colorado and Texas Tech, it's hard because I'm not sure. Texas Tech is not super stable when it comes to definitive wins. That sometimes teams kind of hype themselves up for these big games, and whether or not they see Colorado as a big game, I don't know. I mean, it's a big game for them because they right now are not necessarily in a position where it would be an easy ride to the playoffs.
Hold on, Brandice. Colorado jumped Kansas State in the Big 12 standings. They're 3rd now. So if Colorado wins out and Kansas State beats Iowa State at home in Kansas State, Colorado makes the Big 12 championship. They just have to win out.
That's what I was saying. Yeah.
Kansas State,
I thought you were talking about that game and not this week's game.
Yeah, because Iowa State and Colorado have 1 conference loss. Kansas State has 2, but if Kansas State beats Iowa State in the finale, Iowa State would have 2 conference losses. Colorado would have 1. Colorado would play BYU for the Big 12 championship. And I think if you're BYU, you can beat anyone left. As long as you don't draw Colorado, I think you're going to be okay. And you're going to win the Big 12 championship with an undefeated record. I think Colorado's the one team, if Shadur and Hunter put it together, they're the one team that can play spoiler and beat BYU in the conference championship. That's why I think it's going to be an incredibly entertaining end of the season in the Big 12. Next up, I'm going to go Georgia and Ole Miss. I like Ole Miss here. Georgia looked very sloppy versus Florida. Ole Miss is at home. I think they're going to beat Georgia, and they're going to create more drama within the standings. And the selection committee is going to use this as an excuse to have 4 SEC teams in the playoff, with a 5th one outside of the top 12. I think that's what's going to happen. Tennessee and Texas will move up to the top of the standings. Ole Miss will be like 8 or 9, and Georgia will only drop from 2 to 10. And the selection committee will use that as an excuse to justify having 4 SEC teams in the 12-team playoff. Because only way we're going to get 3 or less, as if these SEC teams, just the teams that are on top of the SEC keep winning out, and the other teams in other conferences win out too that are undefeated in conference play. But if Ole Miss beats Georgia, I think we're going to see them in the playoff next week along with Georgia. But Georgia should win. But Carson Beck's looked very sloppy the last few weeks, and Jackson Dart's been very good. Jackson Dart's been very good the last few weeks. So I'm taking Jackson Dart and the hot-handed in the upset. I might get some backlash for that. I could be wrong, but I like Ole Miss to win. Lane Kiffin's due for a big win.
Lane Kiffin most certainly is, and Jackson Dart has another quarterback shown flashes of brilliance, but then disappeared at times. And they're the underdog. I'll take Ole Miss.
Blasphemy.
I know Brandice is going to take Georgia, so make your case for Uga.
Listen,
wait, not you, Brandice.
I think that Carson Beck was trying to have a little fun, senior year, get out what you need to get out. It's tough for these guys because they spend half of their senior year, not being able to get, wasted, not really being able to have any fun, party too much. And then, it's over, and then they have to go to the NFL, and, it is what it is. And we already saw what happened to Stetson Bennett when he partied too much after he got out. So he's trying to have a little fun. And I think that the fun's over. I think that Kirby Smart probably came and said, listen, okay, you did it. You did your big one. Now we're here. We're at, some pivotal moments. So tighten it up. Whatever the edibles are that you're doing, let's take it down. Maybe microdose a little bit, And I think he's going to be fine for the rest of the ride out.
Good deal. Thank you guys for being here. That was a great show.
Last game I want to break down was Alabama LSU. I like LSU to beat Alabama. But any thoughts on that game, and then we'll sign off.
These are two of the top quarterbacks I have. Jalen Milroe is an absolute beast, the most dynamic player on the field at any given time. Garrett Nussmeier might be the smartest player on the field at any given time. DeBar hasn't shown that. I mentioned that they haven't done anything. Milroe hasn't had a Heisman moment. He almost did against Georgia, and then they almost lost, and it just didn't look good. I will take Garrett Nussmeier and LSU as the underdog, and I'm good with that.
All right, you want to?
You, Brandice?
You got it.
I like LSU.
LSU.
I think that they have hit a stride.
A little bit biased,
and I think no, not really. I've always loved the LSU, to be honest. It's DBU. I'm a DB. Like I was really sad that they weren't doing well this year. So I'm glad that they're kind of back in a better stride right now.
Yeah, losing Caleb Downs was just bad.
Yep. That'll do it for this edition of Under the Bleachers. We'll be back next week with another college football update and some other exciting games leading up to the final few weeks of the season. You can subscribe to Draft Utopia on YouTube, and you can go to the Under the Bleachers playlist for all the if you missed any previous episodes of Under the Bleachers, there's an Under the Bleachers playlist on YouTube. You can go there and catch up with Brandice, William, and myself. And if you're behind, and you can check that out. But yeah, thank you for joining, and we'll be back next week.